Was childbirth actually that dangerous for English aristocratic women of the past? We've all heard the stories of very famous ladies like Queens Jane Seymour and Catherine Parr who died as a direct result of giving birth. But was maternal mortality really as high as these notable cases might suggest, or were these women unlucky outliers? In this episode of History Calling, we look at the history of childbirth in the English aristocracy over the course of 400 years, and at what the statistics say about a woman's chance of dying in childbed during that time. I'll also discuss the most common causes of death for such women and compare the historic stats to those for the modern-day UK and other countries to give you some context. Obviously, if you've experienced pregnancy loss or know someone who has passed away as a result of childbirth, this maybe isn't a video that you should watch, and rather than risk causing yourself any distress, I would encourage you to leave off here and find something else on my channel. Sources first. The main secondary source I've used for this video is a 1998 article by Judith Lewis called "'Tis a Misfortune to be a Great Lady." I'll leave full details of it in the description box if you'd like to learn more about this topic, and it's well worth a read. If you're interested in learning how to tell the difference between good and bad history writing more generally, you can also check out my website, historycallingofficial.com, where you can sign up to my mailing list and get a free download with 5 quick and easy tips which will do just that. It's linked below for you too. Look back at the history of the English aristocracy, and I'm also including its royal family, and you'll find plenty of instances of tragic deaths in childbed or shortly afterwards, which might leave you with the impression that childbirth was an incredibly dangerous time for women. Of the 5 Tudor Queen's Consort who gave birth, 3 died as a result of the experience, and other famous royals, including Princess Charlotte of Wales, have met a similar fate. Miscarriages could kill too, and had she not had access to modern medicine, the current Duchess of Edinburgh would almost certainly have died as the result of an ectopic pregnancy in 2001 or from a life-threatening placental abruption which occurred with her daughter, Lady Louise, in 2003. Look at historical fiction and you'd get a similar impression. Take Game of Thrones, for instance, inspired by the medieval period. In that show, Tyrion Lannister, Daenerys Targaryen, and Jon Snow's mothers all died as a result of giving birth to them. And don't even start me on the horrific forced C-section shown in the prequel House of the Dragon and carried out on Queen Aemma Targaryen. Yet, in reality, there are other stories of many famous women who had huge numbers of pregnancies without succumbing to death. Queen's Consort Elizabeth Woodville and Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, plus Queen Victoria, are just a few examples. Even Queen Anne deserves to be on the list. Her children may not have lived to adulthood, but carrying, miscarrying, and/or giving birth to them didn't kill her. So what's going on here? How dangerous was it really to give birth for high society English women before the advent of modern medicine? This is where Lewis's article comes in. To research it, she looked at a sample of 1,251 women from the upper orders of English society born between 1554 and 1908 and who died between 1615 and 1959. Of these, she calculated that 61 had died as a result of childbirth or miscarriage, whether this was at the time of delivery or within a few weeks after it. This provided an overall maternal mortality rate in England during this period of 4.8%. As she said in her article, whether or not this is high depends of course on one's expectations. She thought it was low, however, given that over 95% of childbearing age women didn't die as a result of pregnancy or childbirth. When she broke the numbers down further into 50-year cohorts, the stats showed an 8% risk of death between 1750 and 1799 versus just 3.7% between 1650 and 1699 and only 0.2% between 1850 and 1899. She concluded that, quote, "The late 18th century was a relatively dangerous time for an aristocrat to have a baby. Aristocratic women born in the 16th and especially the late 17th centuries had a much better time of it, as did women born after 1850, end quote. She compared her own findings to those of another historian called Roger Schofield, and, because these 1,251 women had an average of 5 children each, agreed with him that women ran a roughly 1% risk of dying in childbed every time they were there. How do these stats compare to others we have available to us? Well, the British government didn't monitor maternal deaths until 1840, but when they did start to do so, the death rate, and this is for all classes remember, not just the aristocracy, was 0.5% until the mid-1930s when modern medicine finally began to make a really significant dent in the numbers. As Lewis correctly noted though, these figures didn't take into account deaths from miscarriages or stillbirths, though those were the events most likely to lead to a maternal death. Nor were many births amongst the lower orders even recorded, especially as such registration was not compulsory until 1874. So the true death rate should definitely be much higher. What about modern statistics though? How do these death rates compare to maternal mortality rates now, which are much better recorded? I looked into this, and in the UK as a whole, so not just England as in the previous stats, between 2019 and 2021, the maternal mortality rate for women dying within 42 days of giving birth was 0.01166%. This then rose in the years 2020 to 2022 to 0.01341%. Still, despite the fact that we are taking in a larger area and are now able to count the numbers of women who die from childbirth complications with near total accuracy, the numbers are thankfully vastly lower than in earlier centuries, as you would expect given the existence of modern medicine. As for the world as a whole, I thought this chart from the Our World in Data website showing global maternal mortality since 1985 made for very interesting reading. The darker the colour, the worse the mortality rates. You're seeing a snapshot of the 2020 data here, which shows that today the central section of Africa is the worst place to give birth, specifically Nigeria, Chad, and, worst of all, South Sudan, which has a 1.223% death rate. This is now considered a shockingly high number, yet it is well below the 4.8% overall risk for our English historical ladies. To put it in context, Belarus, which has the lowest maternal mortality rates, stands at 0.001%, or 1 death per 100,000 births. As you can see from the colours, Western Europe has generally very low maternal mortality rates. Portugal's are slightly higher, but I don't know why. And Australia, New Zealand and Japan are also very low. But the US and Canada are quite a bit higher. If I show you a time-lapse of how rates have changed since 1985, you can see that Canada's rates of death have actually increased since the turn of the millennium, which is a worrying trend, especially for a first world country. I'm going to leave this website linked below for you if you want to take a closer look at the data yourselves, but I do wonder what such a time-lapse would look like for the 4 centuries between 1558 and 1959, if we were able to produce one. So, mortality rates for women in the English aristocracy between the reigns of Elizabeth I and Elizabeth II were pretty awful compared to modern times, even in third world countries, yet perhaps not as bad as some might have you believe. What were the actual causes of death for those women who expired though? For simply saying someone died of childbirth complications casts the net pretty wide. There were lots of things that can and did go wrong, and sometimes being rich was actually dangerous to one's health. Sure, it meant that you were probably well fed and less likely to have to engage in strenuous physical labour during pregnancy, but Lewis has pointed out that some of these ladies engaged in religious fasting, which likely weakened them and made them less able to withstand the rigours of childbirth. They could be further damaged by the interference of what then passed for doctors, and many of those men did more harm than good. They might also recommend a reduced diet for their patient, and treatments administered included bleeding and blistering, which could introduce infection to the mother's system. The same can be said of their unwashed hands and dirty equipment. Their understanding of human reproduction could also be rather limited. Just see the infamous case of the woman who claimed to be giving birth to rabbits in 18th century England and managed to dupe more than one so-called doctor. I have a video on that, which I'll leave linked on screen and below for you. It's quite a tale. It is not true, though, that all medicine of bygone eras was harmful. But before I reveal what I mean by that, if you're enjoying this content and would like to get more from me, please give this video a thumbs up so that YouTube knows you approve, and subscribe to my channel with the notification bell switched on so that you don't miss any of my content releases. You can also find me on Patreon, where I provide bonus material like early access to ad-free videos, mini podcasts, and more. I have an Amazon storefront too if you want to check out my recommendations for history-themed books, TV shows, movies, and gifts. Finally, a big thank you as always to those of you who donate to the channel using the super thanks button underneath videos, as this is very kind and helps me to keep doing what I'm doing. When forceps were introduced, they undoubtedly saved some women, even as they introduced lethal infections to others. But fashions changed over time, and sometimes it was thought best to leave a labour to nature rather than to intervene, even when intervention would have been the better option. A lack of assistance probably sealed the fate of Princess Charlotte in 1817, who was left to labour for days until her son was stillborn. Forceps might well have saved at least one of them. Massive bleeds after an apparently successful delivery were another obvious cause of death. Queen Jane Seymour, from what we can tell, may have retained part of the placenta inside her after delivering Edward VI in 1537. She then suffered a massive hemorrhage and infection and died 12 days after delivery. Catherine Parr also succumbed to childbed fever, as it was known, becoming delirious for a time before regaining her mental faculties shortly before her death 1 week after the birth of her daughter Mary. I have a video looking at the mystery surrounding what happened to that child, by the way, which I'll leave linked for you. Another disadvantage suffered by aristocratic women was the fact that they were less likely to nurse their own children, and so more likely to become pregnant multiple times in quick succession, not giving their bodies a chance to fully recover from one pregnancy before launching into the next. The age of the mother had an impact too. Teen mothers were more likely to die, and aristocratic girls were more likely to be married off at obscenely young ages. Lady Margaret Beaufort was wed at 12. Her granddaughter, Princess Margaret Tudor, was married off at 13. Catherine of Aragon was 15 when she married Prince Arthur Tudor. All these women survived childbirth, though Lady Margaret seems to have been permanently damaged by her one experience with the future Henry VII when she was 13, and she never became pregnant again that we know of. Catherine of Aragon didn't become pregnant until she was 23 and had married Henry VIII. She is a good example, though, of someone who endured numerous pregnancies in a relatively short span, at least 6 in 10 years, and lived to tell the tale. Other girls were not so lucky, and Lewis gives several examples, including the 18-year-old Elizabeth Lady Livingston, who died in 1611, and the 17-year-old Charlotte Lady Garlies, who died after birthing twins in 1739. Again, let's compare this to the modern era. According to the data I found online, and I've left my source linked below for you, thrombosis and thromboembolism, these are basically blood clots, was the leading cause of maternal death in the UK in 2020 to 22, during or up to 6 weeks after the end of pregnancy. COVID-19 was the second most common cause of death, followed by cardiac disease and mental health-related causes. Modern women are much less likely to bleed out during delivery or die from ectopic pregnancies or infections introduced by their medical team. Their health and that of their child or children can be monitored during pregnancy. They can be vaccinated against diseases which might have contributed to their deaths in earlier centuries, such as TB, and they can have blood transfusions and successful C-sections which save both them and their babies. These options weren't available until the 20th century, when a C-section would almost certainly have killed the mother. Pregnancies can also be more easily spread out thanks to the advent of contraception, and large families are not generally sought after in first world countries anymore due to much reduced infant mortality rates. plus the fact that it's just so darn costly to have kids these days. There's a whole other conversation we could have about that actually, particularly as childcare in the UK now is cripplingly expensive. Of course, there are risk factors today which were less likely to impact women of the past, such as older mothers, smoking, and obesity. So to sum up, was childbirth really that dangerous for English aristocratic ladies of the past? Well, it was certainly a lot more dangerous than today, thanks to a combination of factors, from poor and even dangerous so-called healthcare to early marriages and back-to-back pregnancies. However, it wasn't as dangerous as you might think. Most women survived childbirth most of the time, 95% of it in fact, and when you think about it, that's not that strange. We'd have died out as a species if reproduction was that dangerous for us, especially given that we usually only produce one kid at a time and a single pregnancy takes 9 months. We're not breeding like rabbits and rats after all. Still, modern maternal mortality rates are much lower, even in third world countries. And so, ladies, it's my opinion that even if you're in South Sudan, it's generally still statistically safer to be living now and not then. As always, I hope you found that interesting. Let me know below if I've changed your opinion of the dangers of historical childbirth in any way, and for more pregnancy-related videos, try one of these options next. Whatever you choose, please enjoy, and until next time, keep learning.